Carol, it seems from the video footage which has been released online that it may well be the case that a protester who was outside the consulate actually got dragged into it, which would be an extraordinary sequence of events if so. It's worth noting, I think people will know that embassies are officially the territory of the foreign power that runs them. This isn't necessarily the case with consulates, which actually technically still remain UK territory. So Alicia Kearns' comment about UK soil, I think, was quite pointed in that particular context. But overall, it's a sign of Chinese diplomacy in this particular case having taken a very peculiar turn, since while it's evident that China has protested on many occasions at free expression of anger against the Chinese government, I don't think there are any previous cases in recent years of it actually turning to violence.
Yeah, we've had the British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly saying that he's ordered the summoning of the Chinese chargé d'affaires to explain what he described as the shocking scenes outside the Chinese consulate. Peaceful protest is a fundamental right in Great Britain, and the Chinese government must respect that. I mean, if Alicia Kearns, and the video footage seems to support it, is right, and there was actually a senior Chinese diplomat involved in apparently beating up a protester, that's pretty serious, isn't it?
Well, the term that will probably be heard around this is one that your listeners may have heard before, and that's the term wolf warrior. Now, this is a term that's been used in the last few years, firstly by the Chinese themselves, but then more and more by the Chinese government's critics, to refer to a kind of very robust action by China's diplomats, both either verbally or in this case it may seem even physically, to basically make it clear that China is not interested in traditional diplomacy in this case, but rather in very kind of actively and robustly showing that it's not going to take any pushback either from people they regard as Chinese overseas or from foreigners. The title comes from an action movie, a sort of James Bond type thing in China called The Wolf Warrior, which is about basically Chinese special forces raiding an African country and rescuing Chinese citizens. But it's become a shorthand for the idea that an awful lot of Chinese diplomats around the world have taken these very confrontational measures against countries where they're placed. It is notable that Britain up to now has not been one of those countries. Chinese diplomats here have been relatively more restrained. You tend to see it more in some countries like Germany, France and Sweden. So this may be a sign that this particular sort of tactic has now been brought perhaps slightly unexpectedly to the UK. I would be surprised if the Central Foreign Ministry authorities in China had authorized this. It sounds like it's more of a sort of improvised action. But it does show that Chinese diplomats perhaps think that they have some kind of scope to go beyond what normally would be considered the realms of diplomatic activity.
Yeah, I mean, we've all seen those scenes of the very brutal suppression of demonstrations in Hong Kong. It does appear that there were some Hong Kong activists involved in this demonstration. I mean, if it is found that a Chinese diplomat was just essentially bringing those heavy-handed tactics and employing them on British soil, that presumably could lead to a further diplomatic rift, couldn't it?
Well, I suspect what it would end up being in, kind of classic Cold War style back from the 1960s and 70s is that Chinese diplomats might well be removed from this country certain Chinese diplomats who are involved might be removed. I suspect the Chinese would then respond by ordering, some British consular officials to be thrown out of China, the sort of mutual actions in these cases. Certainly none of the rhetoric that's come from China so far seems in any way to concede the point. So it is probably the case that this will be yet another of the events, along with Hong Kong that you mentioned and others, that have led to a real chill in the relationship between the UK and China, although it must be said that, relatively speaking, that relationship is not in the deep freeze in the way that it is between China and Japan or China and the United States.
Nonetheless, there is a very significant group of MPs in the Commons, the China Research Group, are very concerned indeed about not just China's behaviour in its own country and in Hong Kong and its attitude towards Taiwan, but in terms of the way that it's spreading its influence here in the UK.
I think that seems to be right. And what is going on is, I think, trying to, particularly through the government, find red lines. So, for instance, on the one hand, we have to note that over 100,000 Chinese undergraduates and graduate students study in the UK in any 1 year. And that's a very large number, which personally I think we ought to welcome on the grounds that bringing Chinese students into our liberal system of education is a good thing on both sides. On the other hand, the idea that this could be essentially a way of bringing more influence in terms of Chinese norms of reducing freedom of speech into our society is obviously something that we have to loudly and actively speak up against. So understanding where these dangers lie and then working out what is the right way both to be open towards the things that we want to have from China, trade relations or foreign students, and push back against anything that might infringe on our liberties, that's the lesson that we all have to learn now.